Welcome to Carbon Connection, the podcast bringing you the latest insights from the front lines of climate action. I'm Lauren Napuck with the Climate Action Reserve, and together we'll hear from industry leaders driving real progress against climate change and explore the ever-evolving world of carbon markets and climate policy. Thanks for joining, and let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the season finale of Carbon Connection. Throughout this season, we've been privileged to hear from incredible speakers as we've explored key topics shaping carbon markets and climate policy. Today, we're diving into a topic at the forefront of our field: how credit buyers prioritize quality when incorporating carbon credits into their sustainability strategies. Buyers bring unique perspectives to the intricate landscape of carbon markets, playing a vital role in achieving climate goals and supporting high-quality emissions reductions. To unpack this important topic, I am really thrilled to be joined by Andy Kruger, Senior Director, Environmental Markets at ClimeCo. Andy is well-versed in law and engineering, holding degrees in both fields and bringing with him 36 years of experience in environmental markets and policy. His career began at the U.S. EPA, and then he branched into corporate energy and environmental and sustainability programs. Andy has worked with numerous international, federal, state, and municipal entities, including California's Air Resources Board. He served as Director of Emissions Markets at Cantor Fitzgerald for over a decade, and most recently served as Senior Vice President of Merrick's Spectron. His background across strategic counsel, professional brokerage services, risk management approaches, and advocacy enhances each of ClimeCo's service lines. With Andy, I'm really excited to round out this season as we explore how credit buyers evaluate standards to secure high-quality credits and their role in fostering thriving carbon markets while financing critical global climate goals. Andy, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here, Lauren. And thanks so much for inviting ClimeCo to participate and provide some insight and some lay of the land, how things have been going. It's always an interesting journey.
Absolutely. I'm really thrilled to be speaking with you today. And Andy, to really jump into this topic, how have carbon credit buyers' preferences and priorities evolved in recent years? And what factors have driven these changes?
Yeah, that's an awesome question to open with. There's so much to unpack there. One of the things that, look, markets ebb and flow. It doesn't matter whether it's carbon markets, renewable energy markets, natural gas, oil, stocks, equities, bonds. They ebb and flow. One of the central tenets that's still crucial, and it certainly applies to the carbon market, is due diligence. That's something I'm going to talk about as a theme overall. It's still important. And one of the things that when people started out doing carbon, this is all voluntary related. So you have to remember companies are doing this of their own choice, right? So they're deciding to step out and do something positive that they don't have to do. Hard stop. The criticism that is levied against them is unfair, I believe, strongly unfair, because they're trying to make change. Now, with that said, what buyers are considering now is, as they're deciding to do things, but in the past, they were more focused on, is it a real reduction? Do their due diligence? And then what's the optic look like? So in the earlier days, one of the projects that people liked, and when I say earlier days, let's talk about the voluntary market really kind of kicking into gear about a decade and a half ago. It was the face of a cow, dairy digester projects, for example. ClimeCo, of course, at the same time as we were doing those, was also doing industrial gas capture and destruction. Immediate change too, an important effect on the N2O, for example, capture and destruction, just like methane destruction associated with the dairy manure. But the face of the cow is much more appealing than an industrial process. Although my wife says, I think it looks great. It looks like a chitty chitty bang bang machine. So it's pretty cool, There's lots of stainless steel and piping and it's neat. So I guess it's a perspective thing, but the cows are always better received. And so we morphed from that into the industrial process where people realize that it doesn't look so bad and it's cool. And there's nothing better than chemistry, a neat and repeatable process. And then we came back into, well, wait a second, trees hold CO2. I remember that from elementary school. And that's an important component too, and always has been. It was discussed a decade and a half ago, but was not as much at the forefront because we needed to really get our heads around it. Fast forward to today, we've got people that really understand this and are experts who have worked into the carbon space and can explain it. So the trees have become the face of the voluntary market. I think we're at a tipping point now where we're actually starting to go back to the industrial processes a little bit because of discussions that have been ongoing. Some of it warranted, some unwarranted, I would absolutely argue, but concerns about reversals, avoidance versus removals, and all of that's playing into the picture here. So the drivers that are doing this, and what's really causing all this? Well, at present, the companies, again, let's go back to that point that I made. They start out doing this voluntarily. They are doing this to make change. Yet, in a lot of the more recent news, there's been criticism of projects. And that's been transferred onto the companies who bought them, which the presumption here you've got to have is that they're not doing things recklessly as a buyer. They're doing things to make change because they recognize climate change is real and they want to be a good citizen, be it an individual or a company. So the discussions that go on, with the press, it creates, used to be it would cause newspapers to sell for a big headline, right? Now it's clickbait, right? So you get negative stories always sell, for whatever reason, better than a positive feel good thing. So that's driving some of it is the avoidance of perhaps negative press. People are doing back to the same old due diligence again. And it doesn't have to be onerous, but you got to be careful. I mean, climate action reserve is a great start. The methodologies that you provide are important and well vetted. And that's something that is a great starting point for your due diligence, but also asking questions. But, ultimately, yeah, I should probably say price is always a factor, but then also why are they involved too? What's driving it? Is it Corsia? Is it Article 6? Are they focused on the quality of the credits? Of course they are, but high quality doesn't necessarily equate with high price. I ultimately come down to this. When I think about the avoidance versus removal discussion or the press holding things up, the world's on fire right now. We got to do something. And companies are trying to do it. And if you look to their goal setting and target setting, they're ready, they're making plans, but they're not able to do the immediate change of purchasing a carbon offset because of all the recent skepticism. It's almost internal fighting. That's, what is a good credit? What isn't a good credit? There are credits.
Andy, thank you so much walking us through this history of markets generally and how you mentioned they ebb and flow, but ensuring that companies and actors in the market are doing their due diligence, but also championing the work that companies are doing because, as you stated, it's on a voluntary basis, and companies are stepping up right now and seeing that the world is on fire and we need their climate goals and corporate actions and working with organizations like both of ours to really secure high quality carbon credits to make a true difference today and not year on year when things are only looking bleakly worse. So I really appreciate you walking us through that. And on that note, what strategies do buyers employ to assess the quality and integrity of carbon credits? And how do they navigate the various standards and certifications in the market? And I appreciate you giving nod to the work that the reserve does as well. So, including us, but others, how do they look across everything that they have to tackle?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, so springboarding off of what you said about mentioning car, I mean, that's something that assessing the quality and integrity of carbon credit. So one of the things that comes up is what registry and what methodology. That's a good starting point. What's our feel for what's acceptable? And that's something we convey to folks. But then also, take a look at who's involved. Who's the project developer? Do they have the experience? Do they have the financial capability to sustain the project if it's a new project? Sometimes what is quote unquote quality could be nothing more than it meets the standard. Is it Corsia eligible, for example? We had the case with tokenization a little while back, a couple of years ago at this point, but all of a sudden there was this massive interest in Vera credits, and the price was the primary driver. And then people started saying, "What's going on?" And then the word got out a couple of days later because people were buying some very old vintage credits, and they were completely agnostic on project. And it was because they just weren't concerned about what was going on. So the reality of the thing is that the price can be a driver too. And that doesn't necessarily equate with quality, right? But anyway, so typically that's part of it. We heard the ICVCM with the CCP label was going to make a difference. It has made a difference, but it's not like $1 or $2 difference. It helps people get to yes on certain projects. But ultimately, same old criteria apply to, you've got to look at the impact of the project, the commercials. And these are the big things we always suggest to our clients and then build out from here, but I'll just rattle them off. So it's impact, the commercial aspects of the project. What's the contract going to look like? What's the counterparty's level of success? Have they had any problems with their projects in the past? What type of volume are they looking at? The clarity of the ownership of the land. If we talk about a forestry project and what's going on, is the finance truly secure? Things like that. And then classic term, right? Project itself, additionality, permanence, depending on the project. Well, with industrial gas projects that are, especially if they're capturing and destroying, it's pure chemistry. It's very easy to discuss the permanence of that. And it's also the case with the additionality too. You can see where in a lot of those cases with industrial facilities, they have air permits, it's required by law versus what they're doing voluntarily. But these are things that happen. The strategy, what's your goal? Are you pushing for innovative change? We've seen a lot of the computer industry and technology folks push us in a direction for innovation in the projects that they want to purchase from. And in some cases, price is not a barrier because they're looking at it as seed money. So they want to drive change. But again, it's not always that you have to spend a lot of money too. But so, what it comes down to is, and especially in those instances, but even in the simplest transaction, look at who your counterparty is. Are they a partner? Do they have success? Are they financially solid as a seller? And then, the other thing is the country, where the credit's being generated. So you get past all of these initial hurdles that I was talking about, but you also have to consider sovereign risk. What's the viability of the project? Could something happen that's unusual? So these are factors that play in. Article 6, Corsia, driving some of what people are using to assess quality, which is they're kind of not. They're saying, okay, if it's going to meet this, I'm going to do that. But we're excited by the progress that's been made with Article 6. It's got to be implemented. But it's not something, and it's just like even in equities and stocks and bonds, even. It's not something where you turn the switch and it's going to change immediately. And also, just because we've created a parameter that helps clarify things, it doesn't mean that everything's secure. And so there's still this need to get to a point where there's a little bit more clarity on how to do things. I've got some ideas that I can talk about some more. Maybe we'll relate to a little later on, but how we're already in place with some offset projects that are going on. Ratings agencies are part of the decision making now. We'll probably loop back to that later. I think there's a lot more discussion to unpack there too, because rating agencies in carbon are not like rating agencies that we see right now for other markets.
Thank you so much, Andy. Hearing you walk through each of these pillars, it's really helpful to see that there's a lot that organizations and companies need to consider, and being able to know and see partners like registries and the methodologies they're working on, and the project developers themselves and the level of experience. But then there's these standards that are being created, like the ICBCM, or policies like Article 6. So a lot at play, but I think when you can take that step back and see that all of these pieces will help you be successful in incorporating carbon credits into your strategies is key here. So I
Oh
really
yeah.
appreciate that.
No, I appreciate you pointing that out. And it really, the reality is it is key. And you just said something that's important. It's a strategy, right? And the carbon offset is not the only tool. And that's something that a lot of folks misunderstand. It's a bridge in a lot of cases for companies that are beginning to make change internally. But as an emission source, whatever the case may be, it might be something as simple as an office space and you're balancing travel and other things. There's all the time that's taken to implement processes for change. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't necessarily happen in a year or two either. That's why there's target setting bodies like SBTI that are set standards. That's a topic I'd want to unpack too. But the reality is that companies are making change and they have to have time to implement these programs. So the carbon offsets are part of that.
Definitely. I appreciate you carrying that forward as well, as these things do take time. And there's a lot that has been going into play for companies building their strategies and building their plans, which actually leads me to a next thing I want to ask you, which is the key considerations for organizations when deciding whether to incorporate carbon credits into their sustainability plans, which, as we've talked about, is a part of a whole. But how do they ensure these credits complement that whole part of their climate strategy?
Yeah, yeah. So look, part of it's, as I alluded to earlier, and it's ground and project one. making a difference. All right. So then they're going to look at the carbon offsets provide a means for immediate impact. The moment that the project starts up, you're seeing reductions. So it's almost analogous to an automobile, for lack of a better thing. And you really want to simplify it. It's a lot like a catalytic converter on a car. You take the catalytic converter off your car, it's stinky. Well, greenhouse gas isn't that doesn't really work for the analogy because it's not necessarily a smell. And that's especially true with N2O. Not necessarily true with methane, but it is true with N2O. And the significance of the N2O is you've got this massive multiplier, right? It's a greenhouse gas with 270 times the CO2 equivalent. See, so it's an immediate change like a catalytic converter, and you start splitting N2O into nitrogen and oxygen. And so these are things that people are looking at as to how they continue and start going on things to complement their broader climate strategy, like you just said. So you got to make the change. If you're that facility, you don't have to make the change itself, but you could, for example, at the source, add the technology and make some of the reductions for your own stuff. Maybe even finance that change in part by selling the excess that you don't need to balance yourself. Well, that doesn't necessarily work, right? Because it's ton for ton. So, but but ultimately, sometimes there are projects that you may have excess reductions that come through. But to look at the product that what they're doing and figure out what they can do. Is it balancing travels? Is it balancing our fossil fuel consumption in some way? We're making widgets and there are emissions associated with it. Are they a member of a target setting? Do they align with a public forecasting or some kind of commitment for change? So this is part of how they ensure that the credits complement or meet their strategy. Some of it's self-imposed, some of it may be by the standard settings body. I think that we're seeing a little bit of an exodus from SBTI lately. It's ironic, but the companies want to make change, but yet the way that they're allowing companies to affect change is put handcuffs on. So it's actually had a little bit of a backfire. And companies leaving that organization is not necessarily reflective of their desire, which continues to be to respond to climate change. One of the things that I could tell you from my perspective over the years is we used to say, what does climate change look like? What is it going to feel like? Is this real? I mean, when I started out, we were worried about smog. We were worried about particulate matter. These were the original emission stream, acid rain, all related to different pollutants. But what does it look like with CO2 effect? And the reality is we're seeing it now. And guess what? It's exactly what the scientists and smart people were saying earlier on. They had the capability to forecast, which is a wonderful thing. We could forecast what markets look like, we'd all be quite wealthy, right? If we could forecast what is an acceptable credit, well, wait a second, we can forecast what's an acceptable credit. We know the chemistry. So that's an important thing too. But we've seen the climate change. Now we're seeing the impact. And my point in bringing that up is that's making companies make change. All you have to do is talk to anyone in the insurance industry right now. They are realizing the impact of climate change because what do people insure against? Fire, natural disaster, wind, rain, storm damage. There are companies that are literally choosing to not take on or cover your house, for example, in certain regions of the country. You have to go to more expensive policies. That traces back to the pocketbook. This is the beauty of markets. This is what I've always loved about this business. People may have altruistic intentions, and that's absolutely important, and good intentions are important. But I could tell you that some people don't have altruistic intentions. You start taking money from them or figure out ways to make change that'll allow them to profit, they absolutely react. That is the beautiful concept of an environmental market. It drives change too. But, apart from aligning with public forecasts that you may make, the sellers are making these changes because they can make money on it or can finance it. They're not doing this because they want to do it for their own. They're doing it because there's the finance. The buyers are causing this to happen.
Thank you, Andy. And that's such an important piece here is that the carbon market really is serving as this financing mechanism and tool to not only create innovations, but its immediate impact. We are seeing climate change right now. It's not something that's on the horizon. Every day we see news stories about what's happening in the world. So being able to also hand in hand see projects being uplifted on the ground because they're getting financing and they're getting
Yeah.
support of the carbon credits is really beautiful to see. And I appreciate you giving these examples as well and showing that there's a lot at play here. There's a lot of opinions and drivers of change, but to come full circle and support climate change initiatives by supporting projects is really key here.
Yeah, it's an amazing journey. But the central theme has always still been there is look at the project, what's going to drive the change, why are the buyers doing it? And now, like I said, I talked about the individual who's got the concern about her house, for example, maybe not being insured, but you've got the impact on the companies too. They've got a manufacturing facility in one of these areas. Their staff is impacted. The facility itself is impacted. We saw that just recently in the Carolinas, apart from Florida. There were remote areas where there are factories impacted that have never, ever had to worry about such things. It's tragic, but it's also, apart from the personal impact, it's a financial reality too. And so these are driving forces for sure.
Definitely. And I wanted to ask you about risks related
Sure.
to credit reversals. You've given nod to things like wildfires and other unforeseen events, and specifically the role of insurance. So I am wondering if we can dive into that a little bit more, and how do buyers really address this risk, and what role can insurance or other risk mitigation strategies play in securing the integrity of purchased credits?
Yeah, it's a great question. First and foremost, you've got to look at the risk of reversals, and it really comes down to what is that exposure for real. Now, when I talk about an industrial gas project, and that, of course, to the farming industry, that could be a digester, it could be landfill gas, whatever the case may be. The chemistry is there if you destroyed the atom, right? So that risk of reversal doesn't go away. The moment that you take methane, you split it apart. You take N2O, you split it apart on down the line. You've made the change. Now the question was there any kind of gaming that may have happened? We've seen that just recently come out with some of the cook stove projects and forestry projects where there was a little bit of lack of transparency. The beauty of markets, by the way, no matter what people say, markets sort things out. It may take some time. Think about any company and the exposure you hear, oh my goodness, they were doing something and it disclosed. People are very ambitious when it comes to dollars and cents. And it's just the way things are. You have to have faith. And that same faith also applies to the results that I was referring to earlier and causing things to happen. So there's that issue that comes in. But there are buffer pools, for example, and I think about forestry, that's the concern. That's the more transparent. People talk about fires, wind, some type of blight. So you have buffer pools. You've got to take a look at what's happening too. I talked about due diligence, but the reality is that part of the due diligence process is a straight face test too, sniff test, if you will. Who are you dealing with? You don't want to be replanting or reforesting in an area that would just not sustain forestry without having climate impact in and of itself in some way. You have to take a look at that. That's part of your risk consideration, right? That's the due diligence process. A lot of companies self-insure is the best way to put it. They're making sure they understand after they've gotten involved that if there's a problem, there's going to be a way around this. There are insurance products, but you got to look at what is the cost of that versus that self-insurance risk. What are you buying? Is it an exclusionary policy? What's the financial viability of the company insuring it? Are you paying a premium that 10 years you might need and there's nothing left? So there's a lot of factors that play in, right? And that's why we have markets again. You've got products and depth going around it. So these are questions to ask. But one of the things that I think is so significant is you want to encourage this activity. You want to have people keep doing this without the risk of a look back period. And I alluded to this earlier. We have, of course, offsetting programs that are voluntary, but we also have compliance programs that allow for offsetting. The Western Climate Initiative, which currently includes California and Quebec, and soon may include Washington State, allow for the use of offsets. And one of the things that they do within that offset program is they say, all right, you create the offset, we issue the credit after it meets the methodology, for example, that CAR have vetted. If it meets our offset programs, it will be accepted. At that point, there's an 8-year look back period. And it goes deeper than just the credit. Maybe there's a problem at the project or they discover something retrospectively they could call back. But that time decays to eventually being zero. They also allow for double verification, which is like having an engineering firm come in and look twice at this project and make sure that it is doing what it's supposed to be doing. If you do that, it's an onerous process. I can tell you that firsthand, but it's an onerous process. And you shrink the look back period to 3 years. The key thing there is there's certainty at the end. At some point, it's either 8, 3, or 0, and at that point, it becomes fungible. Now that's rolling. So the same project, when its new vintage is issued, same issue, 8 years. It's an ongoing process. So it's not a one and done, but it's absolutely, a significant point of certainty that gets rid of the risk of reversal. And I would argue also encourages buyers with certainty, just like all these others that we're talking about. The due diligence, sometimes you get into a leading edge or a unique project. I could tell you within our end, I work with some awesome people. They're in very different niches within the space. We're in forestry space, the low carbon space, in the N2O space. And, how does a ratings agency really qualify to have that expertise? Are they financially savvy too to look at these projects? And, the, the ratings agencies are interesting.
Definitely, and yeah, that's actually, rating agencies have been trying to tackle rating these individual projects and understanding these protocols behind the projects,
Yeah.
and they are rating against different criteria, and we've seen that some projects might get different ratings. So, how should buyers be approaching these different ratings across
Yeah.
different ratings agencies?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking about the due diligence thing. You have to do the due diligence on the due diligence provider, the rating agency. That's where we are right now, right? Again, what's most interesting, I think, as we watch this is the ratings agencies themselves are self-appointed. To get different degrees, we have to go to school. We have to meet certain qualifications. To become a certified trader, you have to take certain exams and study for them and pass, depending on what you're doing within the financial markets, to get your series licenses. With ratings agencies, they hang their shingle out. We're rating carbon projects now. And as you alluded to, there's a very, very broad approach with different results coming out for the same projects. And one of the things that's interesting, I work with people that are experts in certain areas, but they're not experts in everything. If you're going to be a ratings agency and you're going to rate certain types of projects, I would argue that you have to have an expert at your disposal. And one of the things we've noticed is the ratings agencies, in some cases, not all of them, are loath to actually talk with us about the projects. They just rate them. I've got the stuff in. So they should be able to vet what's real. This is the same thing when companies get audited by rating agencies on their books and the like. They don't necessarily understand the business line, but they take a look at it and they ask questions to help understand that if the people that they're rating are telling the truth and are presenting viable arguments. So I think that's an important component that some of these rating agencies are missing. It's the financial or actually the project level understanding. So it's very tough to rate a project without that, I would argue. But what is a buyer left with? How do they feel comfortable? And we're seeing that built out in a number of cases that companies that never had an environmental manager or maybe had an environmental manager, but never had a sustainability person or somebody who truly understands all this now have this in-house. Take a look at the standards body, the methodology. Again, that due diligence concept. I think that you just have to take the straight face test, but the due diligence is something that we've got a business line that we help. We also have a reputation to uphold, which is something that I've always been enamored by it. When we were younger and there were only a dozen of us, the C level, one of the things our CEO always said is you make sure that you always do the proper work and you're honest. You don't want to be on one of those news magazine shows. That's the straight face test. And he still says that. And I think it's such a great self-obvious test. Envision yourself in that awkward moment. You don't want to be there. So this is part of what the company needs to do too, who's buying this, have a little bit of knowledge in-house. And if not, outsource it. And that's part of one of the reasons our business line is growing. We're now over 100 people. We continue to do project development, but we do a tremendous amount of advisory work too. The benefit of having these folks with the expertise who are there helps you get educated and maybe springboard so you don't necessarily need the assistance later on. But it can help in any number of ways, mapping it. What's the proper way to even do your sustainability? Anyway, so my feeling about the ratings agencies is some of them are really interesting. I mean, there's history out there on the net. It doesn't forgive. And then I'm starting to feel like there's some inherent conflicts of interest that have come about too in some of them. If you're going to be a ratings agency, you got to be careful what business lines, but their expenses are tremendous right now. And so they're looking for other ways to make money. So there's a little bit of a yin and yang that's paradoxical. Or I would argue in some cases they're creating some conflicts too. They've got to be careful with that. Calling up a company and saying, hey, have you seen this project that we rated? it's great, but your project isn't ready. You should sign us up. So both buyer and seller, they're calling there, depending on which hat they're putting on. That's kind of conflicts of interest. Anyway, but when I talk about the due diligence and the like, I think it's very important to say this is getting better now because we have people that can help do this. It's getting better because the markets are actually culling the chaff. I think that's really an important thing. We've had problems, but guess what? Those problems have people realizing if you're a bad actor, you're not going to get away with it. And we've seen this forever. There's been levels of fraud or whatever in any market. And you know what? When there's rules that are intended to do it, people get creative. If they want to be criminals, they get creative anyway, but at least it gets sorted out. And I think that's one of the outcomes of becoming mainstream now. I could tell you war stories of all sorts of bad actors that have come into the market, some because it was new and they were taking advantage of people that had good intentions. It's all sorts of areas. But ultimately, it's not that complicated. And I laid out some of the things that we consider when we're developing a project or advise our clients. But ultimately, ICBCM, we talked about the CCP label. Is that really the end game? You still have risks. So you got to take a look at the projects. And really, I would advocate that if we can get something over time into the voluntary market where there's a point where there's certainty, that is just going to be wonderful. I love the CCO concept and the Western Climate Initiative that at the point with California carbon offsets, that the project credits are done and set for as a point of certainty. And we're seeing indeed that the buyers are funding projects because they're comfortable with that.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate you giving nod to the power of knowledge and becoming educated and working with the experts in these fields. Even here at the reserve, we have in-house folks that work on soil, they work on forests, they work on industrial processes and gases, and they should be called upon because they are understanding these principles like additionality and permanence and all the good things that we're looking for in carbon projects. So
For sure.
definitely. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And pieces like WCI, and we've covered ICBCM and the CCP labeling. So we're seeing this rise of initiatives that are aimed at enhancing transparency and credibility within the market. And you've also given lots of nods to how actors can be better working together and collaborating. So I'm wondering, how can stakeholders like buyers and sellers and project developers really collaborate more effectively to continue to strengthen market integrity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a central theme here that's coming about. And it started with some of the goal setting and the standards bodies, the target setting bodies in part. I think this rule versus wins discussion. I like the springboard for that because sometimes I literally get to the point where I was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is what we're doing right now. We're infighting in amongst us. We all have the same common goal. Climate change is real. We've got to do something. Why are we nitpicking? If there's some chaff that needs to be culled, it's going to get sorted, especially because of a market. We don't have time to debate this. 2021, the economy took a little bit of a change, but we also had a zenith, if you will, for carbon markets. And then all this debate started and there was analysis paralysis. I hate to use that term because it's so generic, but there really is. We didn't see the renewable energy concerns come out. That's a whole other can, but renewable energy credits, it's a little bit easier to trace electrons. You don't have the same issues. You either generate it or you did to overstate it. And then there's the financial side. But with the carbon offsets and the like, and all this removal, we've got to absolutely have changes that go into place. And ultimately, the markets help sort this out. The standards bodies themselves, you alluded to what the expertise is at CAR. It's a great example. When I look at projects that we're considering, one of the things, we'll certainly look at is who's the developer, but also who's the standards body? What the organization is it that's got the methodology? How has it been vetted? What's the risk of the project really not doing what it's supposed to be doing? And, that's one of the things we try to do to get that better product on the shelf to people. But I think the market itself sorts that out too. Over time, buyers set standards, the sellers set standards, the buyers have become more sophisticated. I don't think they have to be sophisticated, but they should always go in with just as they would. I like to use the stock and bond example because I think it's market related, but We're never going to quite get to that point where it's that fungible with offsets right now until there's a little bit of certainty. And I think that California, that WCI example is a great layer. Article 6 was intended to do some of that, but look at the layers of complication. You have to get government at that federal level, you have to get international governments to write letters of authorization. That adds a complexity that we've never seen with the voluntary offset program. And again, it's voluntary. And then there's costs, it's interesting the countries have their hands out. I love the idea of the money flowing back to indigenous folks and landowners, if in the case of forestry, for example. I think that's very important. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, great example. We love these projects, but so do the buyers, and they pay a premium for that too. There's so much to this, and it really depends upon how simple you want to be. But the price is so extraordinarily different. You could be looking at credits that are very high integrity at the $3 or $4, and on the other end, you could be spending $1,000 for a direct air capture credit. But look at the sheer space of that machine and where it takes to put. It's awesome. It's an awesome concept. It's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. It might not be within my lifetime, but they're taking CO2 out of the air. Flip side of the coin, we're not even putting stuff up in the air for $3 or $4. We're splitting it before it becomes a problem, and that's the beauty of markets too.
Definitely. And yes, I appreciate you sharing these different examples as well, because I think that's something that fascinates me most about the carbon market is the array of project types that are out there and the actors that are coming to the field to develop these projects. But then you also giving nod to things like the sustainable development goals and money going back into communities, which I think is an important pillar of where we like to build our protocols and methodologies off of here at the Reserve is ensuring that projects are happening for the climate benefits, but importantly, supporting the communities on the ground, championing their livelihoods, as well as support climate change initiatives. So,
Yeah, it's something I was excited to see, which I think really personifies. It's a project that we're working with where it's in Mexico. It's a forestry project that involves a number of indigenous folks and their different tribes and the tribal land. And part of the process that goes on, and we love this, is that they're involved and they're going to be making money, right? But the go, no go on prices is actually at their auditoriums filled with the folks that are on the land to vote yay or nay. They're deciding as a group. So that's proof positive, of course, that the money's going to them. But I haven't seen that where they're actually voting yay or nay. It's not just one tribal member who's saying yay or nay, but it's actually the whole group.
absolutely. Yes, that's a wonderful picture that it paints of the impact of community. And likewise with our Mexico forest projects, being able to have this general assembly of people coming together to say yes or no if they want to develop a project. It really shows you how it is an all hands on deck approach and that these projects are not being developed in silos. They're being developed hand in hand with communities, which is so important here. So definitely
Yeah.
appreciate you raising that.
Oh, yeah. I think I look back at my colleagues over in various parts of the world and, different forestry projects, mangrove projects, and, the changes that they've made and funding. We've even seen it with some of the plastic credit areas that we've gotten into, but just the money flows to the folks there and it has an impact on well-being, but also the environment. Fishing, for example, or wherever the case may be, getting back to some of the more natural space. And that's the side or the co-benefits of these projects that CAR is looking for, as is our, for example, Vera too, and any of the others to gold standard on down the line. These are important standard setting bodies that are looking for more than just the carbon offset and making sure it's real, but there's so much more to the co-benefit story too.
Yes, looking at co-benefits, that is such an important note, Andy. I appreciate that. And before we close today, Andy, I first, want to thank you for your time, but also going through our conversation today, ask you why is it so critical to understand buyers' perspectives for the future success of carbon markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start with the simplest point. And thanks so much for being here too. I want to make sure that I can't stress how much I enjoy talking about this, but I appreciate the opportunity. All of us do here. What do you have for a market? You have a seller, but you have a buyer, but you have a buyer and a seller. It's a chicken and egg, right? You can't have one without the other. Where does it start? Well, we could probably trace some to the other, but the buyer's perspective is important just as much as the seller's. But they ultimately are relying on the other. And I think that's one of the reasons we've got to look at that, right? If there's no buyer, the seller's not necessarily going to get into the game. They may try, but they're going to fail. We can afford to fail right now. Climate change is very real. We have to have effective changes. So some of the stuff, you could argue it's the seller is a company making process changes at its own facility to reduce its carbon footprint. But they want to leg into one of the, they can only do so much in terms of reductions at their facility. So at some point they also become a buyer, which they, arguably they could have been a seller, just to use that example. But you could see this whole rotational thing. And to have a market, you've got to have a seller and a buyer. And there are no projects without finance. Hard stop. How that finance happens, the buyer's perspective in part. And if we're going to do voluntary changes, the buyer's perspective is a very important part of all these things. The buyer's got to show up.
Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate that. And just to highlight what you've said, we cannot afford to fail. And working with buyers so closely and taking their perspectives into account is only going to enable the future success of projects and to really fight this battle of climate change. So I really appreciate all of your time and your expertise shared today, Andy, and for giving us this wonderful end to the season finale of Carbon Connection.
Thanks so much. And thanks to you and all the organization for all that you've done. It's an important thing. You're making change. I think about my kids' future, and I'm grateful knowing that you're out there doing what you're doing too. Or, this important podcast that gets the information out for people who want to understand what's happening. Thank you.
Likewise, Andy, thank you so much, and to the greater ClimeCo team. And it's only partnerships like ours that can keep this fight for climate change going. So I really
Indeed.
appreciate that.
You bet. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
Be well.